Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 13, Ready Player 2. I want to start this week with an apology. Last week I said this episode would come out on Thursday. As you can tell, today is a bit past that. I've been in Iowa for a while now working for the Census Bureau, and there's a lot more work than I expected. We're just going to keep with our regular weekly release schedule for now, and I'll be more honest with myself and with you about these things in the future. If you ever feel like you're missing an episode, go check our Twitter account, as that's where I'll post updates. Quick aside, if you live in the United States, no matter your citizenship status, no matter where you live, please fill out your census questionnaire if you have not already. It's completely confidential, the benefits of completing it are numerous, and completing it on your own is the best way to make sure people like me don't constantly bother you about completing it. So do your census. Alongside voting, it is like the easiest civic duty we can do here in the US. Last episode, we discussed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea just before the invasion. Today, we are talking about the state of the Republic of Korea leading directly into the invasion on June 25th, 1950. One might think that, with as large a presence as the United States has in South Korea today, and because the Americans were the shepherds of the country at birth, that the United States has always been deeply involved in South Korea. And that's only half true. In 1949, as part of the wider drawdown of the armed forces because of massive budget cuts, American combat troops left the Korean peninsula. They did not leave behind nothing, though. American advisors were still intimately connected with the government, the military, and industry. The Economic Cooperation Administration and Korean Military Advisory Group were small in their own, but when considered within the relative scope of the American presence in other countries, were sizable. This boots-on-the-ground presence was matched with financial aid worth $100 million, earmarked by Congress for fiscal year 1951 in March 1950. This is certainly not a small amount, considering the total South Korean national budget for 1951 was $120 million. So American support for Korea was not as small as one may think, but it wasn't as extensive as it would become after the war. I've mentioned it a few times over the last couple weeks, but as a reminder, a resurgent Japan was still seen as the major threat to East Asian security by the Chinese, the Soviets, and the North Koreans. Japan was specifically mentioned in the Sino-Soviet Treaty discussed 2 episodes back as the chief aggressor. This was not without cause, of course, partially because the ravages of Japanese imperialism were still fresh in the mind. But also, the Americans were remaking Japan into a bulwark against communism in East Asia as the decade ended. When Secretary of State Dean Acheson spoke in January of 1950 on the American defensive perimeter in the Pacific, the United States had already been rebuilding Japan and reintegrating its economy with the South Korean and American economies. This was not out of a sense of duty to the Japanese or Korean people. These 2 countries provided new markets for American industries unshackled from the needs of wartime production. With a surplus of rice from the 1949 harvest, Korea once again exported rice to Japan, and the difference in domestic consumption that now went to the export market was again made up with other grains, often provided by American importers. Korea and Japan were incorporated into this rapidly growing globalized economy rebuilt in the aftermath of World War II. You'll remember that this policy of replacing Korean rice with foreign grains is similar to that of the colonial administration. Just 2 weeks before the war, the Republic of Korea and Japan signed a new trade agreement worth $35 million, excluding rice exports. This treaty could not save the South Korean economy, though. Inflation was high and growth was low for everything except specifically targeted export industries. This is all to show that the Soviets, Chinese, and North Koreans had reasonable concerns about the true motives of the Americans, as it all looked like they were trying to build up their greatest enemy, who had also been the enemy of the United States not that long ago. Militarily, the United States had a heavier hand in Korea. The Korean Military Advisory Group had about 500 military personnel in Korea. 500 may seem small, but keep in mind that this is the largest military presence in the United States outside of Germany and Japan. These advisors were placed at the highest levels of the South Korean military to train officers and ensure proper administration of the military bureaucracy. The Republic of Korea Army, the ROKA, was basically midwifed by the United States, growing from the constabulary of the post-liberation pre-independence days to a force between 90,000 and 100,000 men under arms by the middle of 1950. By 1950, though, there was a bit of a realization that things in Korea were getting a bit too expensive for what was received in return. When the chiefs of staff of the different armed forces visited Japan in March, Lieutenant General Gordon Rogers, the head of KMAG, discussed with them a timetable for drawing down K-Mag within 3 months. The plan was set, and by early June, many of those higher-ranking officers that had such a large impact on the South Korean military up to this point were out of Korea, either in Japan or otherwise returning to the United States. Just before the war, the remaining members of K-Mag attempted to lower the amount budgeted for national defense by the government of the ROK by 25%. This, of course, was ultimately preempted by the invasion, but it shows that while the US played an instrumental role in propping up the South Korean state, it did so reluctantly. Syngman Rhee, the President of the Republic, was also in a precarious position. Not too precarious, mind you. Rhee was definitely an authoritarian and controlled the South Korean state with his small cable of conservatives and an iron fist. But, to appease his American observers, elections loomed at the end of May. The political scene in 1950 was not much different from that of 1945. The conservatives had captured much of the state apparatus by appealing to the Americans' desire for the appearance of strength over any substance of democracy. They still had almost no support in the rural areas because they simply did not care enough to build support in those regions. The conservative elites were content to use police force to, compel peasants to the voting booth, and opposition parties were kept weak enough to never mount a viable challenge to Rhee's authority. This lack of an opposition party structure led many opponents of Rhee to declare themselves independent for the election, and amazingly, they actually won a fair amount of seats. Now, none of these newly elected men were communists, but that doesn't mean the Americans weren't scared of the possibility. Rhee accused the new liberals in the legislature of having a red tinge, and the politicians back in Washington ate it up, giving aid funds a provision limiting their usefulness to any coalition government containing communists. Again, none elected were actually communists. This was just in the middle of the Red Scare in the United States, and something a bit similar was happening in the ROK. So to even label someone a communist held real consequences. Before we get into the disposition of forces for the ROKA, a quick story of Cho Man-sik and 2 Southern communists. At the beginning of June, North Korea reached out to the South and offered to trade Cho Man-sik, who had been in political prison for a few years by this point, for 2 communists held in the South. It just so happens that these 2 men held in the South, Kim Sam-yong and Yi Chu-ha, were important to the underground resistance activities the North was organizing in the South. These arrests further hampered the resistance activities south of the 38th parallel, but those were already not as effective as some in Pyongyang would want you to believe. Oh yeah, there was a bit of a guerrilla movement going on in South Korea during 1949 and 1950. This was kind of tied into the Jeju and Yosu rebellions from 1948 and 1949, but in much smaller pockets all across the Republican half of the peninsula. What was not different, though, was the ruthlessness with which the police and army beat down the peasant guerrillas. Most of the guerrillas were killed or otherwise discouraged from their guerrilla-ing by June 1950. That's part of why there would be no mass uprising to celebrate and support the arrival of the glorious Northern comrades after the invasion. In the second week of June, Rhee responded to the North's trade offer by asking them to release Cho's son with his father. On June 18th, both parties agreed on the new conditions except for how the trade was to be carried out. On June 23rd, the North offered to execute the trade on the 26th, but considering what would happen on June 25th, different types of executions were in the cards. Both Kim Sam-yong and Yi Chu-ha were instead put up against a tree and unceremoniously shot on the 26th. Cho Man-sik was presumably executed sometime later in the year. I don't know if this was just a feint designed by the North to throw the Southerners off the scent of war, or if it was a genuine attempt for each side to get something of value out of the other. But it turned into just another human disaster that would become all too common during the coming conflict. The guerrilla attacks in South Korea away from the 38th parallel added to the security challenges the South Korean leadership had to tackle in 1950. While they did crush the guerrillas in their country, that took resources away from the 38th parallel. Every man devoted to hunting guerrillas, which was not an easy task, was one less man standing watch on the border. At the same time, the ROKA was purging any left-leaning influences out of the armed forces. And I say left-leaning influences, but What I really mean is they were just kicking people out of the military for any ties to communists or leftists. As the clock ticked closer to June 25th, these three challenges would hamper overall readiness levels for the ROK. Those overall levels of readiness were first really considered with the withdrawal of American troops in 1949, but it was not until March of 1950 that a formal defensive plan was issued by the Ministry of National Defense in the form of Army Headquarters Operation Plan No. 38. This plan was built around the assumption that the North Koreans would try to take Seoul first and placed the weight of the South Korean defensive line between the 38th parallel and Seoul. That is the correct assumption. I mean, it's pretty dang obvious. Seoul was by far not just the largest city in South Korea, it was the largest city in both Koreas and still is today. It's the economic, cultural, and political center of the peninsula, and on top of that, it's really close to the 38th parallel. Today, it's about 30 miles from the border, but of course, the border shifted slightly towards Seoul at the end of the war, and what was defined as Seoul back in 1950 was smaller, so between 30 and 60 miles or so, south of the border, is a reasonable estimate, I think. The United States Army never really built any defensive lines along the 38th parallel, except for temporary vehicle checkpoints. When the responsibility for defense transferred from the US to the ROK, so too did those checkpoints, but that's about it. There was just nothing else to transfer. So the ROKA had to quickly construct hardier defensive positions, often with the help of local peasants and students. By 1950, things along the 38th parallel looked roughly as they had in northern France in 1914. Open trenches, razor wire, and mines were the name of the game. But there were key weaknesses that would play a big role on June 25th. There were no anti-armor mines, few concrete-hardened positions for heavier weapons, and large stretches of border without razor wire, an important tool in funneling enemy troops into specific areas. Bridges were rigged with explosives to slow enemy advances south, but few defenses were given meaningful depth, but still were expected to hold back the initial attack. Depending on who you ask, the South Korean forces were either evenly matched or vastly outnumbered by their northern counterparts, at least by 2 to 1, often by more. I think I fell into that trap last week, as I should have drawn from more sources on that figure of 100,000 in the KPA. That is the danger of working with a lot of unknown variables, because the Korean People's Army has never released full numbers of the disposition of forces before the war. Bruce Cummings puts the North Korean total number of soldiers between 90,000 and 100,000, and the dense first volume of the Korea Institute of Military History's record of the war puts the North Korean total closer to 200,000. So you can understand that this is a number very much up for debate and heavily dependent on both the weight one puts on these sources and the bias of individual authors. We don't have this issue with South Korean forces, though. We can say with relative certainty that the ROK had about 100,000 men in uniform in June of 1950. And whether or not they were outnumbered by their northern counterparts, there are two well-defined differences between northern and southern soldiers. The Korean People's Army had a great deal more equipment, and North Korean soldiers were much more fervent in their mission. That enthusiasm comes down to the political education soldiers underwent in the Korean People's Army. This political education was, again, part of the wider socio-cultural reforms implemented after independence that just did not happen in the South. It also comes down to the differences in training provided by both armies. KPA's training regimen was frankly just better than the ROKA's. Military education was not really present in the ROKA at the base level until January 1950, which was just too late. By June, only 25% of all battalions in the ROKA had completed meaningful battalion-level training exercises, the things that most resemble combat. There's no specific percentage for the KPA's battalion-level training, but we do know, from Cummings and from the Korea Institute of Military History, that the KPA's training was significantly more extensive than the ROKA's and had started earlier, so they just had more time than the ROKA. The differences in equipment were also staggering. While the Soviets provided a great deal of new war material produced after the war using excess production capacity freed up by the end of World War II, the United States did no such thing. The US largely switched back to a consumer-based economy after the war. The KPA had 250 tanks and 175 or so warplanes, while the ROKA had 22 planes, mostly for training, and 0 tanks. That's right, the ROKA had no meaningful armor component, and worse, they had no meaningful defense against an armored attack. The Soviet T-34s used by the North Koreans were too well armored for any of the heavier weapons used by the South Koreans. Those heavy weapons the South did have were just worse than their northern counterparts. While the North had 500 large artillery pieces, the South had just under 100. And the North's artillery almost doubled the range of the South's artillery, 11,700 meters to 6,500 meters. So the North held the advantage in every category, but the South did not know this for sure. They could only plan for the worst and hope for the best by this point. Operation Plan Number 38 set out 2 lines of defense, a forward primary line and a rearward secondary line. The primary line would blunt the main northern attack, and the secondary line would fill any gaps exposed in the first attack. The primary line of defense would conduct initial defensive operations in 3 stages: delaying action, counterattack, and then stabilization north of Seoul. This is a pretty basic defensive plan. Specifically, the 7th Division was placed in charge of the main core of the defense near Uijeonbu, north of Seoul, supported by the 1st and 6th Divisions on each flank. The 8th Division was placed near the eastern coast to defend from amphibious invasion, and the 17th Regiment was given responsibility for the decidedly undefendable Ongjin Peninsula that had no land connection with the rest of South Korea. Outside of those divisions, in the 17th Regiment, most ROKA forces were in or around Seoul. The Capital Security Command, which was of division strength, between 10 and 20,000 soldiers, was responsible for the defense of Seoul and was bolstered by the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Divisions close by, who all had orders to hurry to Seoul the second the alarm went up. The shadow of China loomed over southern Korea as it did in the north, but this was not the shadow of the People's Republic. It was the shadow of the Republic. Rhee thought Chiang Kai-shek would be a much better strategic ally of South Korea than the United States, and that the 2 republics should march across the 38th parallel hand in hand. This, of course, was not something the United States wanted, as they did not want to be in any way tied to the instigators of a conflict in Korea. A closer relationship between Chiang and Rhee would logically embolden the more dangerous aspects of their personalities, drawing the United States into conflicts it did not want to be involved in, not yet at least. The only thing at the end of the day that kept the Chinese Republicans from joining the Korean Republicans and marching north was they just kind of ran out of time. Had the Korean Communists not attacked at the end of June, I'm sure Rhee would have pushed for an attack of his own sooner rather than later. That's what he had done since he took office, and I really think he would have seen it through to the end. There's one final thing to discuss before June 25th, 1950. Through the late spring and early summer of 1950, the ROKA had gone on and off readiness alert. At the end of April through the beginning of May, Army Chief of Staff Major General Chae Byung-duk directed border units to conduct thorough patrols of their sectors. Around the elections of May 30th, every division was put on alert for emergency muster in case of invasion. Between June 11th and June 23rd, the entire army was again put on emergency alert. It expired on midnight, just as the calendar turned over from June 23rd to June 24th. On that day, that Saturday in June, an entire third of the Republic of Korea's army was given leave to head home to help their families, to spend some time off base. While this was certainly good for morale, the temporary boost would be very short-lived. The first reports of suspicious troop activities north of the border arrived in Seoul late on June 24th. Much too late for anything to be done to avert disaster. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now. Next Tuesday, we will finally make it to the beginning of the Korean War. A quick programming note, sometime in the next couple weeks, I think I'm going to re-release episode 12. I found a new book at the Chicago Public Library that goes into much more detail about the specifics of North Korea's preparations for the war that I want to incorporate into that episode, and that was incorporated into this episode. I'll let you know once it's out, and I'll give you the specific timestamps of the edition as well, so you don't have to listen to the entire thing again. If you're listening to this after, say, October 2020, ignore this and know that you've listened to the updated episode. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.